Now is the time to lean in, to listen, and to act. Welcome to The Quiet Life. Hey guys, welcome to this episode of The Quiet Life. I'm back as always as your host, Michael James Wong. And on this episode, I'm actually joined by Anthony Warner, who's a professional chef, a writer, a curious investigator, and actually also known as the Angry Chef, and someone who's really challenging making us critically think more about the connection between food, health, and the planet. Anthony, welcome. Thanks for joining me today.
Hello. Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Hey, I mean, it's great to have this conversation. I mean, over the past few seasons of The Quiet Life, it's really about cultivating lots of ways that we can have personal practices, understanding for ourselves about well-being. But on this season, what we're really doing is trying to expand the conversation and actually dig in a bit deeper. And, when I was told about the work that you do, and, we were introduced through mutual relationships, I thought it was really interesting hearing about the work, hearing about you as an individual and the approach that you take to kind of this world of food and wellness, and actually talking about maybe the disconnections about it. So, in this episode, what I thought we'd chat about is kind of to jump straight in and maybe ask you a little bit about kind of your background, and kind of how the whole Angry Chef thing came to life.
Yeah, I can. I mean, my background, I suppose, I trained in science. I have a degree in biochemistry many years ago. And then for various reasons, I got into cooking, worked in professional kitchens for quite a long time. So, I'm a food person. And that kind of the thing that I've dedicated my life to is cookery and enjoyment of food. And a few years ago, 2006, I started noticing a lot of stuff. I mean, I look at food trends. As a chef, you look at food trends. And at the time, I was working in the food manufacturing industry, developing sort of products and helping make products healthier. And I started noticing a lot of stuff on social media and especially Instagram and also books coming out about a lot of younger bloggers and writers talking about food and health and the connections between food and health, which Absolutely. I thought was quite interesting. I thought it was quite an interesting development, people talking about health so much. But as I started to look into it, I started to worry quite a lot about some of the information that was being put out there. I started to think, some of it was unscientific. Some of it was not, was not stuff I would be able to support. Some of the claims being made were not didn't measure up with the evidence, the scientific evidence about food and health that was out there. And so I started to sort of challenge that, and I started to talk to friends and about it quite a lot, and to people I work with. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll have a go at trying to write something, and I wrote a blog called I started a blog which initially was anonymous, called The Angry Chef, back in about 2016, and it sort of it was really designed to be shared with a few friends and a few colleagues, just as a sort of poke fun at some of the stuff that was out there, some of the ridiculous claims being made. And it suddenly became quite popular. I think a lot of people were noticing a lot of this stuff and worried about it. And it also decided to take on a slightly more serious angle as I looked closer in and found some of the sort of darker stuff that was going on within this sort of area, which was supposed to be, it was kind of termed wellness, but actually some of it was really quite dark and quite unpleasant. And the blog gained popularity, and it very quickly turned into books. And I've just finished writing my third book, as sort of a part of a trilogy of Angry Chef books on different topics. But the first one was the Angry Chef book, was about different types of diets and taking some of the big popular diet fads and exploring the science and explaining why the science behind them was suspect, but also explaining how that can be quite harmful and damaging for people. It's been an unusual journey, which I didn't really expect, but it's been, sort of taken me to some strange places, including recording podcasts and wellness podcasts, which is something I never thought I'd be doing a few years ago. I think it's important to have someone out there challenging some of this stuff, because otherwise, people can say anything, and sometimes, especially with people's relationship with food, when you start playing around with that, it can be quite damaging. And I'm sort of hopefully see myself as someone who wants to protect and help people enjoy food and get value and happiness out of food without being made to feel guilty about it. And that's kind of the heart of everything I do, is to try and get people back from this sort of guilt and sort of difficult associations with food, and get them back to sort of what food should be about, which is enjoyment and pleasure and being part of celebrations and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, all of this is really, really interesting, and I first of all thank you for being almost putting yourself in that line of fire to have these conversations. Now, when you kind of originally started having these conversations or seeing these things on social media or on the internet or at events, these types of things, I mean, could you give me a few examples? Like, what types of things were you actually seeing that kind of worried you as a scientist and as a chef?
Okay, I mean, I'll give one example. There are loads, because there's so many. There's many fad diets as there are, people really. But the alkaline diet was a classic one, which is quite an old idea, but really based in what I would consider sort of complete rank pseudoscience. It's not, the prospect that you can alkalize or acidify your body using different foods is just not, has no basis in truth at all. And I'd known about that many years ago, but I noticed it, I said, in about 2016, starting to resurface in a lot of blogs and a lot of writing, and people selling the alkaline diet. And this went right up to people claiming it as a cure for very serious diseases. Some people claiming it's a cure for any disease. Lots of people saying it's a cure for can be used as a cure or a treatment and a prevention of cancer, which is just not the case. And that's not just a mistruth, that's also a damaging mistruth, because it has led, and there are many cases of it leading to people abandoning conventional cancer treatments in order to cure themselves through diet, through sort of thinking they can somehow alkalize their body by eating lots of vegetables, which is just not true. And part of the blog and part of the book is about taking that and explaining why that can't be the case, why it's so damaging, and looking at some of the cases of people who had been hurt by that false belief, and also looking at some of the people who had exploited that and made an awful lot of money selling these sort of quack dietary cures. And like I said, I think people talking about food and health is important. And I think it's an important debate to have, but when it goes down that sort of route, and that's just one example, there are plenty of others, then you end up at a point where this idea of wellness becomes actually harmful. And I think there needs to be sort of policing of the sort of language that people are using. And when people start talking about the alkaline diet, and this included some very prominent, very highly paid, very influential bloggers and social media personalities in the UK and in America, but I focused on the UK really.
Sure.
That I felt that was a problem that needed addressing, and so I did. And you're constantly fighting fires with these sort of discussions, but I think we sort of I think that has moved away from that sort of alkaline diet being part of the mainstream wellness language.
Sure. And I think, as always, I mean, there's always going to be different fads or trends or conversations that do pop up, not just in food, but in all aspects of wellness, and actually in all aspects of, let's say, modern life. People are attached themselves to things that they can be, that they can celebrate, things that they can talk about, things that they can kind of hang their hat on. And I think what's really interesting for me hearing this is that, even first and foremost, you've always approached food as a scientist, or you've approached it from the point of actually, maybe let's call it functional or actual well-being, as opposed to maybe superficial or topical or conversational well-being. And I mean, for you, when you first started on this, let's call it, journey between food and wellness, was it always science first? Like, when you're growing up, was it always, I love science, and then I found food, or it was both at the same time and then they just kind of married up?
Probably a little of the latter, really. I mean, science is something perhaps the other way around to a lot of people. Science is the thing that I love, and cookery and food is the thing that I do for a living.
Right.
Which is perhaps a little backwards. Most people are probably the other way around. But there is that marriage between the two. There is that very important discussion about nutrition that has to be based on science, and nutrition is obviously very important for health, perhaps not in ways that people easily understand. The other thing that I'm really fascinated in, and has come more through my writing than anything else, is this the psychology and the decision making people have around food, and why people are so inclined to these false beliefs around food. Why is it that food is kind of this gateway often to misunderstandings of science and pseudoscience? Nutrition science is probably the one touch point that most people have with science. That's the kind of part of scientific research and discovery which most intersects with people's lives, genuine real lives, day-to-day lives. So that's really important to remember, and I'm really fascinated by why that sometimes leads us to have these sort of false beliefs around food, or to often, particularly with food science, to believe celebrities or over scientists. I think we've seen that a lot with what's going on at the moment as well. But people have this sort of inclination to believe, to take belief from places perhaps they should, putting trust in places that perhaps they shouldn't be putting trust, and to not believe places where they should be putting trust, like sort of qualified scientists who spent their years live studying nutrition. So I'm fascinated by that psychology as well, and I think that's really, really important. I think the psychology of why we eat is probably the least appreciated aspect of nutrition science. The things that actually lead people to make decisions about food.
Sure.
And I think that it is so important and incredibly understudied. We have, people talk about sort of health-related, diet-related diseases. We have buildings full of people studying micronutrients and proteins and fats and vitamins and all these things, but and we have huge amounts of money spent on the study of that aspect of a science. We have very little on the study of psychology of science and why people eat the way they do. And actually, the psychology is probably the bit where you could have the most impact on people's health.
Right. I mean, that's really fascinating. And obviously, it's not a new conversation by any means, in the sense of looking at both the nutritional aspect and the psychology behind why we eat. And I think you're absolutely right in this understanding that probably even more over the past, let's say, 5 to 10 years, as the rise of internet, social media, all these kinds of things, that lots of conversations have kind of sprung up. I mean, what do you think is the place then for people who are, we can't take away people's genuine passion to want to help people, to want to share things, to want to advocate for, the benefits of healthy eating. I mean, where is the place in conversation? And, what is the role of, let's say, influence as it intersects with expertise?
I think, you can't deny how important influencers and influencers are. Expertise is only going to get you. Expertise is not going to sort of sell huge numbers of books. It's not going to sell sort of health advice, because people actually people are more likely to be influenced by people who, for various complex reasons, whether they aspire to be like them or whether they sort of have a particular sort of affinity for them, or whether they think that someone like them. There's many reasons why people are more likely to take advice from influencers. And the role of influencers then, in my mind, is to look at what is actually evidence-based and look at what is actually important, and only translate that information and no more. And the role of the scientists and the sort of nutritional science community is to help those influencers understand, what good quality evidence is, and what are responsible things to be communicating. And that's a very difficult balance to find. That's a very difficult thing to play, because there's lots of people who look like experts but aren't really experts. There's lots of people who just are interested in selling a particular narrative based on an ideological belief. There's lots of people who just are interested in making money out of people and exploiting people who are perhaps desperate and looking for answers because they haven't been able to find solutions to their health and well-being woes within conventional healthcare. So there's all sorts of people there's all sorts of problems with that, but we really need to find a better balance, a way of taking good quality scientific information and getting the people who have influence to communicate that. It doesn't happen enough. I mean, what one of the big problems now is that we have social media, and what that's done is put people into silos very much. So you have sort of silos of information and bubbles where people exist. So you have a load of different, quite extreme beliefs which are perpetuating and not really talking and communicating with each other. And I think the way we access information has dramatically, more than anything else, more than any other change in society in the last 20 years, has been the way we access information. When I went to university, I had to go to a big library if I wanted to find out pull up a scientific paper, and I had a small number to choose from, and I could, a few ways of researching. Now I can access any scientific paper using my written thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of papers on any subject just by typing a quick search on my phone. So the way we access information has dramatically changed, and what we need to do is get better at interpreting that information, because it used to be, you used to go to universities to learn information from someone who knew more than you. Now the important thing, because we all have access to more information than anyone can store in their head, now it's about interpreting and finding out what's good quality information. So the way, that's changed in the past 20 years, and the world is kind of adjusting to that, and making sense of it is incredibly difficult. But so it's not surprising we get some of these problems, but I think it's really worth trying to get better at that communication.
Sure. I mean, especially now as the world has sped up, there is technology, there is instant access, there is instant gratification. Do you think there has almost kind of been this creation of people needing or wanting to be experts sooner or quicker? Do you know what I mean by that? Like this opportunity that we can be really passionate about something. I mean, in your category, we're talking food. In mine, we can talk about mindfulness, meditation. Someone else could be talking about writing or even sports. And this need of appearing or feeling this expertise to share. Do you think that's kind of an aspect of kind of this wider, what you would call, I guess, problem with kind of the dissemination of proper information?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We have this. I mean, information is this huge problem, and so if you have, and everyone has access to information now, so how do you stand out? If you want to stand out, how do you stand out? And you take an extreme position often, so I'm not saying that a lot of the nutrition stuff is conspiracy theories, but conspiracy theories, it is said that that's a way that people have of making themselves feel like they are an intellectual without actually the going through the process of spending years studying something. So if you take an extreme conspiratorial position that's different to everybody else, you feel like you have special knowledge, and you can share that with a group, and they can feel like they're receiving special knowledge from you, and that can be sort of very rewarding for people. So that leads to these sort of people instantly become like an expert then if they're sharing something which is different to what everyone else is saying, and that's very problematic, because you get these extremes of belief in nutrition, and you get these extremes of behavior. I look at nutrition now very much as being quite obviously there's less religion in the world now. Generally, certainly in the UK there is, and we're a far less religious country. But people still have that need to signal something about themselves to the world. People still have a need to sort of have an identity that people associate with them. And for many people, nutrition has become that, how you eat, and particularly what you don't eat, has become a really important way of signaling something about yourself to the world. So, many of the people I interact with on social media, I'll look at their social media profiles. I know it's not the real world, but I'll look at their social media profiles, and how they eat is one of the most important things about them. So they'll be vegan, or be carnivore, or they'll be low carb, high fat, or they'll be on various different diets. But that's really high up, often at the top of how the signal they're giving out about themselves to the world, how they identify as themselves. So it's a very important part of people's identity, almost in the same way that religion is. It tells you something about that person if they say they're on a carnivore diet, or they're on a vegan diet, or they're taking some sort of extreme position in nutrition which is against the conventional science. And that's a very strong part of their identity. But what the problem with that is, once it becomes part of their identity, then it becomes quite difficult to then challenge that thing about them, because that's who they are. That's not just a thing they know. That's who they are. That says something fundamental about them as a person. So when you start challenging that, then they're very resistant to, once they've taken up that as part of their identity, they're very, very resistant to hearing any information that counters that. And that's sort of one of the fundamental problems we have in nutrition discussions at the moment, is that it's become so entrenched and so tribal.
Yeah, and I actually even think on a deeper layer, it's not even just the nutrition or the food. It is very much essence to our human understanding, our behavior of labels, identities. The same way as you might say, I'm a lawyer, I'm a doctor, I'm a father, I'm a bicyclist. We have these needs to attach ourselves, right? The attachment to, let's call it, everyday situations or iterations or conversations that allow us to not only make sense of ourselves to the world, but others to make sense of us. And you're right. And oftentimes when that is threatened, or when that is challenged, or maybe when that is just investigated, even at a very basic conversational level, it can make us feel a bit agitated, or it can make us feel a bit threatened, because maybe we believe in something or build ourselves up to believe that we have a certain identity that maybe can be more expanded, as opposed to just sit in the box of I eat this, I do this, and I function this way. But for you, and I look at this as maybe as a very simplistic question after this conversation so far, is fundamentally for you, what is healthy eating then?
I take a very different stance to a lot of people. Look, I'm all for people eating well. I think very few of us eat enough fruit and vegetables. I think there's pretty good evidence to support that. So yeah, eat more of them. For people who do eat that way, oily fish is generally felt of being pretty good. Some unsaturated fats, perhaps cut down on saturated fats. But generally speaking, I'm not one who preaches much sort of specific advice about healthy eating. It's going to depend on your identity. It's going to depend on what you can afford. It's going to depend on what you want. But for me, the fundamentals of healthy eating, and the most important things that food does for people in terms of their well-being, is that food is this incredibly important thing in people's lives. It's not only a source of pleasure, it's also a way we have, almost at quite a sort of fundamental level. It's a way we have of bringing people together. It's a way we have of punctuating our sort of most important celebrations. It's a way we have of making friendships. It's a way we have of coming together with our family. And those are, for me, are the really important things about food. It's about sharing with people, and it's about coming together, and it's about community, and it's about all those things. So for me, that healthy eating is when food does all that for you, and almost without exception. If you're on some sort of restricted diet, if you're on some sort of extreme diet, if you're cutting out certain groups of food, if you become evangelical that you can never eat certain things, then that doesn't bring you together with people with food. That excludes you from the really important things that food can do. So unless there's really good medical reasons not to, I genuinely believe that it is harmful for anyone to be in any of those sorts of diets. And there will be people who have ideological reasons for not eating certain things, and I completely respect that. And I think that's really important. And I certainly respect people who have medical reasons for not eating certain things. But if you look at people who if you look at celiacs, who obviously can't eat gluten because it's extremely harmful for them to eat anything with any gluten in. But there's been various studies of celiacs looking at how, when they move to a celiac diet, how that affects them. And obviously, various aspects of their health improve. But there is a real danger, and it's something we really need to address, is that it has an impact on their mental health. It has an impact on the ways they can sort of come together with friends. It has an impact in sort of occasions when they're going out, which is supposed to be enjoyable, end up being sort of difficult and hard to navigate, especially early on. That for me gives me an insight into how damaging it can be for people to be on restricted diets when there's no reason to, because they will put themselves in all those same positions. They will exclude themselves from social occasions. They will have anxiety about eating a slice of birthday cake to celebrate someone's birthday. They will have, for me, food is supposed to be this great joy of life, and if the ideology or the diet that you follow is creating stress and anxiety around that, and guilt and shame around that, those things, stress and anxiety, and guilt and shame, should have no place in our diets. And they are, as long as you're eating a reasonably okay, varied diet. That stress and anxiety and shame and guilt are the things that are going to be the most harmful thing about your diet if that's included in your diet. And those things are things that can harm your mental health, but that can actually genuinely harm your physical health as well. That can have a massive impact on your overall well-being. And we forget about that. We forget about that far too much. And that, for me, that's what healthy eating should be.
I mean, this is, for me, probably one of the most refreshing conversations I've had in a while about food, because fundamentally with my work, where it's obviously quite different to your work, you focus around the food and the conversation. I often focus around how it looks like from a mindfulness and mental health point of view, what we're actually talking about, which is what, this common ground is fundamentally the bigger issues or the bigger benefits of how we eat, how we engage. And I think what's really nice and what I'm really hearing from you is this idea that food in many ways is the micro engagement of community, of humanity, but it's that sense of the occasion, the celebration, the social situation, all of those things. And you said people often forget. I actually think people often don't even draw the lines of connection. Maybe they don't actually realize that actually by going to a dinner party where they can't have gluten, and all of a sudden now they're sitting there the whole time stressing out, going, am I going to insult someone? Am I going to have something to eat? This is stressing me out. I have a huge amount of anxiety around this, and it builds and builds and builds and builds and builds because of a fundamental food choice. And granted, obviously, as you said, if they're celiac and gluten free and those types of things, that is a medical thing. But if people are saying, okay, well, I'm not going to have any carbs, I'm only going to eat raw foods, I'm only going to do these things, you maybe widen their appreciation for what they're putting in their mouth, but you're narrowing the appreciation of how much impact it can have on the rest of their mental health and the psychology that's built into all of this.
Yeah, I think that there's a really interesting study. It's quite an old study now, but it was by an American food psychologist called Paul Rozan, and he looked at attitudes to food in different cultures. So attitudes to food in a town in America where dietary related disease and dietary related ill health was particularly high and diet quality was particularly poor, and then took a town in France where diets were generally better, and diet-related disease and ill health was generally a lot lower in incidence. And he looked at just not what people were eating, but he looked at their attitudes to food. And the classic result of that experiment was that people were shown a picture of a chocolate cake, a nice-looking piece of chocolate cake. And in America, in the American town, the people who looked at that picture of a chocolate cake, they were told to say what the first word that came into their mind was. Right. And the first word, unsurprisingly, was guilt. And in the town in France, where people had a much better quality diets, the first name that came into people's mind was celebration. And I think that sort of really vividly shows how different sort of cultural attitudes to food can affect the way we eat. Because we're taught to feel guilty about certain foods. Certainly in the UK, certainly in American culture, there's a lot of feeling guilty about eating certain things, whether that's because you believe there's something dangerous or contaminating within that food, or whether it's just you believe that's a sort of indulgence that you shouldn't be having. And when you do that, I think you create a problematic relationship with food, and that can feed into a problematic diet. When you demonize certain foods, there's plenty of evidence of the psychology of eating, that if you demonize certain foods, then they become more important, they become more salient. Sure. You think about them all the time. You think, I'm not going to eat chocolate, I don't want to eat chocolate. You're just thinking about chocolate all the time. Whereas you see it as a nice, indulgent thing that you have perhaps at moments of celebration, it's a special occasion, or you share it with someone and it's a nice thing, then you don't, it's not so salient. And if you allow yourself it, but understand its meaning in your life, then it doesn't become, it's not incredibly salient, it's not something you're desiring all the time. So when you see it, you don't have to eat it. But for some people, certainly if you're making people feel guilty about it every time, that's going to achieve this sort of status in their mind, which is far greater than it actually should be. And I sort of fundamentally believe that that's what we get wrong about food. What happens in the UK, certainly with a lot of talk about health eating at the moment in the UK, certainly COVID-19 related, and but also just related to there's been a national food strategy published recently, and a couple of reports, and there's a drive to help people lose weight or whatever. But it's so much of it ends up being about making people feel guilty and making people feel they're doing stuff wrong, and that they're eating all the wrong things, and that there are good foods and bad foods, and that you demonize all these foods, but you end up creating desire for them, I believe. It's difficult to find empirical evidence for that. You can find some sort of studies doing which kind of confirm that as a belief, but you can't. It's hard to know sort of empirically if that's the case. But it feels like that's a really important thing that we're getting wrong about food, is we're telling people what not to eat. So much of it is like, don't eat this, don't do that, don't do this behavior, and that's a common psychology. That's a common way of trying to motivate people, because when we learn about health behaviors as a child, we're told not to do things. We're told not to play in the road. We're told not to taste that, to take that out of your mouth, to put that down, to not sort of ride around on the back of the dog or whatever. So when it comes to behaviours that make us healthy, we kind of get drawn to these negative things. So don't do that, don't eat that, don't eat sugar, don't eat fat, don't eat carbohydrates, don't eat all these things. Rather than sort of what we should be doing is really looking towards more positive general things. So kind of eat more vegetables, eat more fruits, spend a bit more time eating, try and save certain things for indulgent special occasions, that sort of thing. Understand that when you're having certain things are sort of special, and keep them that way. Those sort of things, like having and healthy diets are almost always more varied. They're almost always like eating loads of different stuff. The unhealthy diets tend to be ones which are very restricted and only a few things. So if you only eat hamburgers and chips, then that's not great. If you only eat kale and cucumber, that's also not great. What you need to do is eat a load of different stuff. I believe we fundamentally get it wrong in terms of trying to motivate people towards healthier eating behaviours, because we end up just pushing it all back towards guilt and giving stuff up, where it should be more about trying new stuff.
Hey guys, welcome to your T2 tea break, which as always is our moment to pause in every episode just to sit back and enjoy a cup. Now this week we are drinking the Quiet Mind tea. Now this is a tea that I really enjoyed because it kind of has very similar qualities to kind of an afternoon meditation, right? It's a great way to pick you up and give you a bit of energy back anytime through the day. But for me, I've been doing it in the afternoons, which has been really, really nice. Now, I'm joined as always by Nikki, our show producer and resident tea lover. And you've got this tea. I know you love it as well, but tell me a little bit more about how you've been drinking it this week.
Well, this is I'm just going to start by saying this is my favourite T2 tea. I just love it. Like, it smells so good and it tastes so sweet. It's just the right balance for me. And it's all the ingredients are organic as well, which for me is really important. I spend a lot of time making sure that my food is from good sources, so that's nice. It's got adaptogens in it, which are like a type of herb that help you deal with stress. Ashwagandha, schisandra and ginseng. That's the main thing in there. So that's what's giving you that calming feeling. You said you really enjoy it, so and that's what's giving you that balance, but it also has quite a lot of other ingredients in it.
Yeah, like I'm reading, there's like lemongrass and marigold and calendula, there's rose, there's fruity apple, there's a lot of kind of sweet flavors in there.
Yeah, but they all give you a lot of good benefits as well. So healing properties, soothing, anti-inflammatory, kind of everything you could possibly want from a tea, really.
Nice.
Yeah.
I mean, and what's your favorite way to drink this right now?
So this sounds weird, but I really like it with a piece of dark chocolate.
I don't think that's weird at all. I think a lot of people probably would enjoy it.
But you would normally think to tie tea and chocolate, but it goes really well with just like a bit of dark chocolate on an afternoon when you just want to have a little treat and sit back and relax and then get back to your day. If you're quite stressed out, it works well.
Great. I mean, I think that is a great piece of advice, and a lot of people will probably take that on board. It's been a great chance to chat about the tea on this tea break. Guys, if you want to find out more about the Quiet Mind, as always, it's in the show notes. You can also log on to t2t.com to find out more about the specific qualities or best ways to drink it. And as always, if you've enjoyed this tea break, make sure you take these last moments, as always, just to sit back, close your eyes, and just breathe. Now back to the conversation. Yeah, I mean, and I really like the way that you look at that. And I mean, obviously, looking at the initiative that just was put out in the UK, which, it talks about no junk food advertising past 9 o'clock, limit buy one get one free offers, no sweets at the checkout, calorie counts must be on food menus, and consultation on alcohol. I mean, all of these things, to your point, very much are skewed to the negative. They're skewed to a negative bias to really show people that essentially, if you do the opposite, then you're falling into the negative cycle. I mean, as someone who kind of works both in the food and the science side of it, and maybe even this sense of how we can kind of look at the language of positive behavior, I mean, that same idea of, let's say, putting calories on the menu or sweets at the checkout, what would be an easy way to just simply flip that kind of language so it's more of a positive behavior as opposed to just negativity for people to digest?
It's actually, I completely get what you're saying. We are drawn to these negative things, and all those things did sound negative. Some of them I don't think I'd necessarily disagree with, because you're just kind of rearranging the environment. If you're not putting things by checkout, it's not. If you were saying to people, don't do that, don't eat that thing, then I think that would be bad. But if you're just moving it a bit out of sight, I don't think that's such a bad thing. Kind of redesigning the environment slightly to try and push us towards healthier things, and that's what we should be doing. We should be redesigning the environment not to stop people doing negative things, but to try and encourage them to do more positive things.
But
so
does that not then only try to address it at the tangible level, in the environmental level, as opposed to the psychological or the behavioral?
Oh yeah, it does. And that's why those sort of interventions won't actually show a reward on their own. But the cat. I mean, I'll go back to the one you were saying. The one thing I was really worried about is the calorie labeling in restaurants.
Right.
For a couple of reasons. Firstly, I don't think there's much evidence, or any evidence actually, that works. That's not necessarily the worst thing in the world with these sort of interventions, because it's in a complex system, so a single intervention rarely works on its own. But my problem with the calorie labeling in restaurants is, it can have a negative effect. So often, there's been plenty of evidence of people sort of wanting to eat the higher calorie options, because for some people that's just like better value for money, isn't it? If you're having something with lots of calories
Sure.
per pound, or whatever, that's kind of something people want to do. I think it's the thing that I said about that sort of those sort of moments of celebration, for most of us, for the vast majority of us, going out for a meal is a moment of celebration.
Oh, absolutely. Now
and
more
it's
than
a
ever.
moment of joy, and I think if you're putting in them, and it's not happening every day. It might be for some people, but for most people, it's not happening every day. And for the vast majority of people, it's not. And it's a time when we're coming together, and it's bringing us together. So then suddenly reminding people, oh, here's the calories. Make sure you don't eat too many calories. I think that's not particularly pleasant, and I think that's taking away from what the experience should be, and you're making people feel guilty and all those things. It's also, I mean, there's a real danger. It might be very triggering for some people who are, there are plenty of people who are struggling with their eating behaviour and struggling with eating disorders, for whom that is going to be quite a triggering, difficult thing. And there's plenty of evidence of that. I'm not, I don't think you can't completely design the world around that, but I think when you've got an intervention which doesn't seem to do much good, and only seems to, I think the whole calorie labeling in restaurants is something that we shouldn't be doing, personally. But I mean, when you talk about the psychology, I think when you redesign the environment slightly, then that does have a psychological influence. And if you're saying the things that are the really good value, the foods that are really good value are perhaps foods that are just a little bit healthier, the fruits and the vegetables and the pulses and the beans and the tin tomatoes and those sort of things that people might use to make sort of slightly healthier meals, rather than what it is now, which tends to be sort of crisps and sweets and snacks. Then that might help, because people generally gravitate towards these, and it'll have a sort of slow and perhaps small influence on people's behaviour, and that'll be one part of a much bigger picture.
Sure.
The bigger picture in terms of obesity interventions has to be a sort of a whole system-wide systemic approach, which is going to depend a lot on restructuring our cities. It's going to depend a lot on just changing people's societal attitudes to food, and it's going to depend on on sort of helping people who are struggling with certain aspects of health and mental health. It's a huge intervention. If you want to really tackle diet-related ill health, it's a huge system-wide approach that's needed. There's no small interventions. There's no restructuring of shelving, which is going to make a big difference on its own. But you have to do lots of things, and you have to do them all at the same time, and you have to be progressive, and you have to think really hard about what you're doing. The thing that I'm most, I think is most important in all of that is to remember what it is you're trying to achieve, because too often, and almost universally across the world and in all sorts of health authorities and public health interventions, we talk about obesity prevention, which I think is problematic in itself, because I'm not worried about how much someone weighs. It doesn't matter if they're healthy. We should be looking at how healthy people are, and we should look at interventions which are going to improve people's health. And I think if we looked at interventions which are about improving people's health, and we had our sort of campaigns based on making people healthier rather than the language of sort of battling obesity and fighting obesity and sort of battling and fighting with people's bodies, I think we would have much better interventions. We'd have far more success, and I think that's the underlying problem of almost every large-scale public health intervention on these sort of matters, is that it's always about fighting obesity. Obesity has correlations to some types of ill health, but it's often a sign of something deeper and more important. And actually, if you took away the link between obesity and ill health, it wouldn't be a problem in and of itself. We should remember that very clearly. And there are many things you can do which will improve people's health without changing their weight. And there are also many things you can do which will change people's weight, which will be very bad for their health. If I wanted to make people lose weight across this country, there are plenty of really, really harmful drugs I could give them which would make them lose weight, but they wouldn't be any healthier, but they would be a lot thinner. And we too often completely conflate thinness with health, and I think that's a really, really problematic thing to do.
And I think that's really, really important to mention and to acknowledge, because there is this sense that, thinness is health or fat is bad. I mean, there is a lot of truth of how much that we need, but also at the same time, to your point, the psychological and the sociological effect for people to associate those at such a fundamental societal level. I mean, I know you mention often in your book and in talks, I mean, you talk about this idea that health in its own right is actually a societal issue. It is a conversation of inequality. But, oftentimes I hear, and I hear this through conversations I have, that healthy eating or good food is a choice of privilege, right? It's, it is linked with, do you have the means to afford better food, fresher food, more organic food? I mean, where do you sit within that conversation?
I think it is very. There's a big debate about this in the UK at the moment, for various different reasons. As a report that came out recently, and there's a couple of sort of social media comments from people who sort of in a quite privileged position, shall we say, and they're with political influence as well, who are saying that we have this myth that people can't afford healthy food. Well, why don't they just eat oats and potatoes and that sort of thing? That sort of very condescending, or sort of Marie Antoinette-like language about these issues, which is so problematic and is so damaging. But when you actually analyse what how expensive or how cheaper healthy food is, or in inverted commas healthy food, then fruit and vegetables are incredibly cheap in some instances. So certain stuff you can buy which is perfectly healthy is cheap, and it is possible to cook good food on a low budget without much money, and it's certainly cheap, certainly very possible to if you're going to spend the same amount of money on McDonald's, you could easily cook yourself a massive home cooked meal, probably for a fraction of the cost. And there's no doubt about that. But it misses a lot of the fundamental points about what drives people's food choices and why they eat a certain way, and why people are suffering from sort of dietary ill health, and why that does correlate very strongly on a socio-economic gradient. People who, the sort of diseases we're talking about, so cancer and type 2 diabetes and heart, cardiovascular disease, those things are in pretty much every country over a certain wealth level are sort of correlated on a socioeconomic scale. So the people who are poorest are more likely to suffer from those diseases, are more likely to lose life years to those diseases, and there's no doubt about that. Obesity is slightly unusual in that regard. There is a correlation, but like I said, I'm not sort of someone who thinks of obesity as a disease or necessarily a problem in and of itself. It's something that does correlate with certain diseases, but if you look across socioeconomic gradient, people are far more likely to die. In the UK, for instance, in the poorest parts of the UK, people have sort of 10 years less life expectancy than in the richest parts of the UK. But in terms of healthy life expectancy, it's more like 25 years the difference. So people will get sick and they will live a long time, ill or disabled or and all these things. And that's a huge problem, and that is partly related to different quality diets, but it's partly just related to the lived experience of not having very much money, and living in a stigmatized existence in a society which doesn't really care for you properly, and that has an effect on your health, and it has effect on your body, and it is likely to cause type 2 diabetes. It's likely to cause cardiovascular disease. It's likely to end up with people gaining large amounts of weight for various sort of hormonal dysfunctions. It's likely to result in people dying a lot earlier and being a lot sicker. That's something we have in society now. We like to push that back onto people's lifestyle. It's very, very common for that to happen, and sort of people are sort of othered in a way. People saying, these people who are on lower incomes, they're just irresponsible. They're not eating properly. They should be eating more vegetables. Look, I'm a rich person and I've found these cheap vegetables and I can make a meal out of it. And that's incredibly problematic, and it completely misunderstands sort of the situation people are in. Because at the end of the day, most of the problems they're having are related to the fact that they don't have very much money and they lead a stressful, stigmatized existence. They're exposed to violence, they're exposed to poor housing, they're exposed to sort of constant threat of sort of financial repossession and all these things which have an enormous toll on people. Now, sometimes that leads people to poor dietary choices. Because you have economies in poorer parts of any the UK and various countries around the world. They are designed to facilitate stress relief. They are designed to help people cope with stress, and that can be alcohol, it can be cigarettes, it can be drugs, it can be sort of certain types of food. And also people have things driving people's dietary choices are not the things that drive dietary choices of wealthier people. There's a time constraint. People are working. People are tired. People don't like to have food waste, so they don't like to try new things. People don't like to have power running on cookers and cook things for a long time. So there's an enormous number of restrictions people don't think about. But more than anything, and one thing that people really don't think about is, when you don't have much money, I was a chef for half of my life before I started writing, and in the early parts of my career I didn't earn very much money, and I lived in some of the sort of some of the more difficult parts of the UK. So I have exposed to these sort of environments, and chefs are people who don't earn very much money. They're the waifs and the strays, so the people you're working with and the communities you live in are very much lower socioeconomic group communities, and you really experience this. But what people forget is also, do you know what? You have a pretty difficult life and you don't have many nice things going on, and so it's quite nice to have something some nice food. It's quite nice to be able to get a takeaway. That's your equivalent of because you're not going to go on holiday. You're not going to, go to a nice restaurant. You're not going to do any of those things. So, an occasional treat, an occasional indulgence is what you do. That's the thing that you do that keeps you a bit sane. And people almost look at people's choices, certainly in dietary terms, and really look down on them and say, why can't you just be more responsible? And I find that one of the it's so difficult to have any sympathy for people making those sort of statements and decisions, because they just don't understand the complexity of what's going on. And if we really, the underlying issue, the underlying thing causing all of it is inequality. It's socioeconomic inequality, and unless we're going to address that, then we're never going to address these massive health inequalities. We're never going to address any of that without really addressing the fundamental underlying issue of socioeconomic inequality. And the problem is socioeconomic inequality is incredibly hard to address. You can't do that easily. So what you do is you fall back on people's lifestyle, and you fall back on criticizing people's lifestyle, and that's unhelpful, and it's insulting, and it creates these enormous divides, and just makes the situation worse. And part of the problem of socioeconomic inequality is status inequality, and when you have people in a position of privilege making these sort of condescending comments, that just hammers home that status inequality more and more and more, and makes the problem worse.
Right. I mean, I totally agree with you, and I think there is such a wide conversation around food, wide conversation around what actually it means to kind of eat healthy, live healthy, and all those aspects that really kind of consider win the wider conversation. Now, I guess the question off the back of that would be, obviously, a lot of people listening to this podcast are going to go, okay, well, this is really interesting. I understand. I see a bigger context here, but what's actionable for me, right? If I'm sitting in my home right now listening, and I'm going, actually, how can I take any of this and make relevancy in my life? I mean, for you, Anthony, what is actionable here for people?
But you buy my books if you want. That's that's a criticism I get quite a lot. I think there are actionable things from a personal point of view, and I would urge people not to feel guilty about how they eat. Not to let anyone else not to make other people feel guilty about how they're eating, even if it conflicts with your sort of ideological beliefs. I think we have this horrible attitude where people of different sort of dietary sects I was talking about, different dietary ideologies do tend to attack and insult people for eating in a way that they perceive as wrong. So I think making sure you never make anyone else feel guilty about what they're eating is really important. Not feeling guilty yourself about how you eat, not feeling guilty about an occasional indulgence, because that guilt's going to do you far more harm than anything a bit of carbohydrates will. So those are things that are really important. But the wider stuff, the stuff about inequality, these are fundamentally complex systemic issues. So it is hard. We do feel a bit disconnected from it, and it seems like it's too big a problem, and we can never overcome it, and we can never make a change big enough. So people just go, "Oh, I'm not going to bother then." People fall back on the idea of personal choice, and they fall back on sort of the way they're going to eat or something. For me, I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think we are all quite empowered, far more empowered than we know, to really help implement fundamental systemic change, and it's in the way you vote. It's in the way you if you're someone who has sort of savings and investments, it's in the way you invest your money. It's in the way you we choose our political leaders. It's in the way that we campaign on political issues. I believe that sort of inequality is one of the biggest problems facing our society, and so you try and vote and you try and campaign in a way that gets us close to that goal in a small incremental way. It's understanding that for these big systemic problems that we actually do have slightly more power than we realise we do. But it's more about campaigning for change rather than pushing it back onto individual choice.
And I actually even really like what you said at the beginning of this sense of not putting judgment on other people on their choices for what they eat. I think we can all really easily understand this aspect of our own sense of guilt with different foods, but in a very strange societal way, it is almost okay to kind of say, oh, you shouldn't eat that. Why are you eating that? We have this sense of placing different conversations in very common situations for people going, oh, well, I eat this and you eat that and mine's better than yours, or this is why I do that and this is why you shouldn't do that. And I think for people listening, that's a really nice simplistic aspect of this whole conversation. While there is bigger things at play, there's wider conversations that are worth being addressed. The understanding that actually to not have a tangible guilt with the things we eat and not to have a judgment laden on other people actually addresses this wider conversation of the need to look at the foods that we eat as a holistic approach that deals with not only our physical health, but our mental health, our social health, and our aspect of actually, not letting it impact our whole livelihood.
No, I agree. I think we have there's a fundamental problem that in a lot of things that I write about and deal with is that we like to create we like to create dichotomies. We like to think of food as good or bad. We like to think of things as virtuous and pure or sort of benign and unpleasant. And we like to divide the whole of the world in that way, and it can be quite unsettling when you try and think about things in with more shades of grey and less dichotomy. But I think in so many areas that's kind of the way forward, to think of a sort of a more and that involves not sort of making people feel guilty and not sort of saying that choice is wrong, this choice is right, because that's very, very rarely the case. In fact, it's pretty much never the case.
Well, I mean, this whole conversation has been really, really refreshing for me. It's actually really nice to hear not a different perspective, a wider perspective. And I think the way that you approach kind of food, healthy eating from a macro point of view of our whole well-being is really, really nice to hear, because there are so many people who are looking at it very functionally on this does this, or eat this food, or try that diet. And I can also understand why, maybe at times there is a lot of pushback that you might get because people are trying to convince you of a certain ideology as opposed to step back. This is a conversation on humanity, a conversation on community, a conversation of celebration or interaction. So it has been really interesting for me, and I do wanted to thank you for joining for this little conversation. What I wanted to say, Anthony, I mean, what's moving forward, a big part of this podcast is not only giving people insights and actions, but also giving them some sort of onward care and connection. I mean, for people, what's the best way to find out more about your work, stay connected, or dare I say, ask more questions that you might be willing to have answers for?
Well, I buy my books, as I said, and I have a blog which I occasionally contribute to now. I tend to do sort of very long blog posts again about issues which I'm particularly interested in at the time, which is the Angry Chef blog. I'm sure people can find that, and follow me on social media, on Twitter and Facebook. But I'm always and I communicate with lots of people. So if people want to get in touch with me, there's contact forms on the website, and they can email me about the stuff that I talk about, and sort of find out a bit more about the various sort of campaigns and stuff that I'm involved with. But it's generally just I encourage people to take an interest in our food systems and understand how important they are, and have these conversations with people they know, because a lot of people have a really problematic relationship with food, and just try and spread a bit more sort of understanding and enjoyment and happiness about how we eat.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. It's been great to catch up. It's great to meet, great to hear more about your perspective on this. For everyone listening, by all means, please stay connected, follow along, catch up with Anthony, buy his books. I know you've got another one coming out soon. What's that one? What's that one about?
January, I have a book coming out about the environmental impact of food, and just sort of how that's a new sort of conversation that we're having often in the wrong way, and it's called Ending Hunger, and it's out in January 2021. It's also about about how our food system developed to fight hunger, and how that should remain at the heart of everything we do, even as we consider its sustainability.
Great. Well, thank you so much again, Anthony. And thanks everyone for listening in and tuning into this episode. And we will see you guys next time on The Quiet Life.